So here I'm taking the carburetor apart, cleaned it. Now I'm starting to put things together. I put the seat for the needle in, putting the jets in right now. Again, very important to use a screwdriver that's the right width, right size, blade thickness, so it doesn't chew up the soft brass on the jets. Just make sure everything is nice and clean inside. When you're putting gaskets in, sometimes your kit has more than one gasket that looks similar because there may be slight model variations of the same carburetor, or the same kit is used for a couple of different models of the carburetor. So try to match the gaskets to the same thing as you took out. Sometimes one gasket will have an extra hole that the other one doesn't, or not have the extra hole, which is almost worse because it can block a passage it's not supposed to block and things like that. So it's always good to check carefully and make sure you get them in the right way around. And please, people, when you're dealing with Phillips screws, use the right size of Phillips screwdriver. I don't know how many times I've seen people chew up Phillips screws when they use a screwdriver that's too small. It's the wrong tip for it, and they wonder why it's sloppy and wonder why it strips the screws. Well, if you use the wrong screwdriver, it's probably going to do that. Just making sure I have all the parts, making sure I have it the right way around. So I'm just dealing with the needle and seat, making sure it's all clean, putting it in. I don't know why this kit didn't come with a new one. Often they do, but it didn't, so fortunately it's in fairly good shape. Same thing with the springs. I'm checking the original spring against the new ones. Can't remember if I put a new one in or if I decided to use the same one because they looked fine. Might as well stick with the original Mikuni one when there's nothing wrong with it. The length is the same and everything is fine. I mean, really, the point of this whole thing is not to replace broken parts or anything on a carburetor that's been used as little as this has. Really, the reason I took it apart is to clean the goo out of it that was clogging it up, because we weren't getting any kind of throttle response or any kind of RPM out of the SeaDoo anymore. In this part, there are 4 screws that hold it on, just so you remember. If you didn't notice taking it apart, Two of them are longer than the other two. Obviously the two that go through that extra metal plate bracket for the side are a little bit longer. As you can see, two of them are slightly longer than the other ones, so put the longer ones on the side with the bracket, the shorter ones on the other side. Little details like this, when you take screws out, they might look the same at first glance, but they're not exactly the same, and sometimes you try to put a screw in that's not long enough and it won't hold, or you put one that's too long and, well, you never know what it's poking into on the other side. I can't, it's not necessarily the case in this thing, but try to match the screws up the right length into the right spot. They're just little details to watch for when you're disassembling something. Now, just as a note, I have never taken apart one of these exact carburetors before. I have rebuilt many snowmobile carburetors, old Tillotsons and slide Mikunis and things like that. I've dealt with a lot of automotive carburetors, and I've dealt with little Walbros on outdoor power equipment and chainsaws and lawnmower carburetors, but this particular carburetor, it's actually a first time for me. But these carburetors, all of them are relatively simple, and really what you're doing is just going through and carefully documenting as you take it apart to put it back together the same way as you took it apart, and replacing the parts as you can. The kit, whatever it has in the kit, new, put them in new. What I'm replacing here are basically little check valves. They're little plastic discs, but they control which way the fuel flows in and out of the fuel pump. Just replacing them means that you'll have a more positive fuel flow, because plastic does gradually fatigue and bend with age. So it just means that it'll work a little better. Now these little rubber nubs that go through, I find that when I end up having to squeeze those through and get them to stay in place, I just kind of push them into place part way. But I gave them a little tiny shot of WD-40 before I pushed them in, just to help them slide through the hole, so I'm not trying to shove the dry rubber through the hole in the metal and end up tearing it. So you just kind of massage it into place with a small screwdriver or something. When it's good, put the one on one side, put the other one on the other side. In new filter, probably the main culprit for the whole thing. Checking the diaphragms, fuel pump diaphragms. Like I said, the kit came with more than one. So what I'm doing is matching up the holes that look the same to make sure, obviously the other one's for a slightly different model of carburetor. And you can see there are also some other gaskets and things that looked like they could sort of fit, but this carburetor didn't have them in there. Again, they're for different models. Again, this diaphragm, put it in the right side up. So this part is the plastic diaphragm that's controlled by the vacuum pulse from the engine that actually does the pumping of the fuel. And so this is the part I didn't actually take off in the disassembly, so now we have to remove this plastic diaphragm. And again, I was just double checking to make sure we actually had a replacement, and we do, which is a good thing. So I need to pull this off, and then the next thing is to remove the gasket, and probably was the most difficult part of the whole thing. It was just a matter of carefully scraping it off while trying not to gouge out the carburetor, the housing, and the other parts of it. The whole thing is to get it nice and clean and smooth so that when you put the new gasket in, that it seals properly. So it took a little bit of time and effort, but anyway, once the job was done, I put the new gasket on, put the new clear diaphragm on, place it on the carburetor, and put the 4 screws in. The last thing to put onto the carburetor once I was done was the, as you can see it just off the side of the screen over in the top right corner, was the adjustable jet that goes in the side of the carburetor. Again, when that's being taken out, it's always a good idea. Normally what I do is I carefully take the jet and screw it in while measuring or noting how many turns or partial turns it takes to close the jet all the way. And then I mark that down somewhere so that when I remove it, I carefully gently screw it in till it seats, and then back it off that number of turns, and that at least gives me a starting point for the setting of the jets. It doesn't matter whether they're idle jets or what they are. That's always an easy way to deal with it. And after that's assembled, now we're just waiting for the snow to melt so we can put the carburetor back in the Sea Doo.